Chapter 5, Ice Rescue. Ranger barked and pawed the ice, but there was nothing he could do to help. Ranger had trained for water rescues one summer, riding in the bow of a boat and sniffing for a training person who'd dive below. When Ranger caught the person's scent, he barked to alert Dad and Luke. They had a special rope in the boat with a float on one end so it wouldn't sink when rescuers threw it into the water. Ranger barked and looked around. There was no special rope here, only the weather lines attached to the pony's reins. Ranger tried to get that rope in his teeth, but the pony spooked and skittered back over the ice. "Hold on, Jack," Ponting called. He pulled some rope from a sled, looped it over his shoulder, and leaped for the ice floe. Ponting's feet slid out from under him. He landed hard on his back, and the rope went skidding toward the open water. Just before it slipped into the sea, Ranger grabbed the end of the rope in his teeth and raced to find Jack. The boy tried to grab onto the edge of the ice floe, clawing and slipping. Ranger pushed the scratchy rope against Jack's fingers. The boy gasped and flailed at the rope, but he missed and slipped underwater. Ranger barked and pawed the rope into the water. When Jack's head appeared above the water, his lips were blue. His teeth chattered so violently that his whole face shook, but his eyes met Ranger's. Jack closed his hand around the rope and pulled it to his chest. "Hold on, son." Ponting crawled to the edge and grabbed the rope. He drove a sharp pick into the ice and used it to steady himself as he pulled and tugged Jack out of the water. The boy sprawled on the ice, panting and shivering. Ranger crouched close to Jack to warn him. The whales hadn't attacked Jack in the water, but they hadn't left either. Half a dozen still circled the ice floe, snorting and blowing. One raised itself nose first from the water, looking over the ice. The whale's big, awful eyes made Jack's stomach twist. He couldn't stop shivering. He pushed himself up on his knees and reached out to pull the dog closer. He tried to say "thank you," but his frozen lips wouldn't make the words. So he petted the dog's icy fur over and over and hoped he understood. The men wrapped Jack in blankets and helped him off the ice. Ranger walked beside Jack all the way to the tent. That night, he squeezed in beside Jack in the sleeping bag Captain Scott had given Jack for the journey. Jack fell asleep right away. Ranger listened to the boy's soft snores and waited for something to happen. At home, when Ranger did search and rescue training, he had to find one person or sometimes two. When his people were safe, his job was done. Ranger had helped this Jack boy twice now. Once when he's almost swept off the ship, and again today. When would he get to go home? In the days that followed, Ranger walked beside Jack as they unloaded supplies from the Terra Nova. They fed the ponies each morning and listened to the sounds of hammering as the men worked to build a hut. "A home fit for kings," Cherry declared. "Is it big enough?" After the supplies were unloaded, some of the men took the ship to another location to get rock and soil samples from a different part of the shore. But Jack still didn't see how the 25 who remained were going to fit in the hut they were building. "Certainly it'll be 50 feet long and 25 feet wide," Cherry said. "And with seaweed insulation, we'll be plenty warm inside." The men moved into their new hut on the 18th of January. Jack helped load supplies into the building where they would spend the winter. Even when the hut was finished, there was much work to do. The men hunted seals and penguins and carved out ice caves to store the meat. At first, Jack hated the idea of eating such curious creatures, but then Cherry told them about scurvy. "You go too long without fresh produce or meat, and you'll be so tired you can barely rise in the morning. You'll have aching bones and bloody gums. Then your teeth fall out and go clattering all over the ice." Jack ate the fresh meat and didn't complain. They'd been in the hut a week when Captain Scott announced it was time to lay supplies for their 900-mile journey from Cape Evans to the South Pole. They would make several trips before the big one, placing food and fuel at planned locations along the way. Jack sighed as he worked alongside Cherry. He was tired of the boring work of getting ready. When he'd stolen aboard the ship back in Port Chalmers, he'd been imagining his grandfather's heroic journey to work in the gold mines. He'd seen himself leading the team to the pole, planting a flag in triumph, not mending trousers, and frying seal livers for breakfast. "I wish we were going to the South Pole now." Jack loaded a crate of biscuits and a box full of medicine and supplies. Ranger's first aid kit was in there too. This trip has been all work and no adventure. "This isn't a game, lad." Cherry tied off a rope and turned to Jack. His voice was sharp. "Failing to prepare means more than not reaching the pole. It could well mean starving or freezing to death on the way." He gestured at the pile of fuel and supplies. "You want to finish helping me load now?" Jack nodded and reached for a crate of pemmican. He knew Cherry was right. He'd heard stories of other Antarctic explorers, men like Cook and Ross and Shackleton, who struggled with blizzards and snow blindness and frostbite. It was no easy voyage, but this trip would end with success. Jack believed it with every bit of his heart. It would reach the South Pole. They would be the first, and he couldn't wait for the real journey to begin. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Ice. When the supplies were prepared, 12 men, 8 ponies, 2 dog teams, Jack and Ranger, set out over the sea ice. It was breaking up in places, so they chose their route carefully. Finally, the ponies and dog teams pulled the sleds onto what Cherry told Jack was called the barrier, the great ice shelf between the mountains and sea. "The snow is softer here. The ponies are struggling," Jack said as he and Cherry walked along behind the horses. "Do we have more snowshoes for them?" The special pony snowshoes made of wire and bamboo seemed to help, but Jack could only find 1 pair. Cherry shook his head. "The rest are back at the ship. There wasn't time for the horses to train with them." "They'll be all right with some rest," Cherry added. He looked off to the left. "What's that?" Jack squinted into the distance and saw 2 snowy mounds. He and the other men held the ponies while Captain Scott walked over to the mounds and brushed away the snow. "They're tents," Cherry said, "from the Shackleton expedition, no doubt." 3 years earlier, Ernest Shackleton and his crew had explored the Beardmore Glacier and climbed Mount Erebus. They traveled hundreds of miles over ice and snow, but they never reached the South Pole. That victory was still to be claimed. All day, Jack imagined what it would be like after they reached the South Pole. "Those bands and cheers at the Terra Nova's departure will be nothing compared to the fanfare that greets us when we return, dog." He patted Ranger's head as they trudged on through the snow. Ranger couldn't slow down to enjoy the petting. He'd joined one of the dog teams to help pull the sled full of supplies. He liked the work, but the lead dog, Osmond, growled at him. Ranger did his best to stay out of Osmond's way. The snow was deep and the travel was slow. 5 miles one day, 10 the next. Then a blizzard kept the men in their tents for 3 days. Ranger was hungry. He could tell the other animals were too. The horses didn't have enough energy to pull the huge loads. Scott ordered men to take some of the ponies back to camp early. The rest grew thinner and thinner. The sled dogs were getting lean too. They were so hungry that one team attacked a pony that was stuck in a snowdrift. The horses fought off the dogs, but the pony was hurt. Too weak to travel even another mile before the men made camp. In the tent that night, Jack leaned down and gave Ranger the last of his pemmican. "It will be all right, dog." Jack's voice trembled. "Father always says that great rewards require great risk." Ranger nuzzled Jack's hand and ate the pemmican. It tasted meaty, and that was good. But it wasn't like the roast beef Luke's mother made at home. Ranger missed home meat. He missed playing in the snow with Luke and Sadie. He missed going inside and curling up by the fireplace. And it was starting to feel like his job here wouldn't be done for a long, long time. Ranger's first aid kit was packed on one of the sleds. Every day as he pulled with the other dogs, he listened for the old box to hum, but it stayed quiet. They traveled a few more days through soft and blowing snow before Scott decided it was time to head back to camp. The men built a pyramid-shaped tower of snow around a heap of supplies. They buried food, oil, and oats for the horses and marked the pile with a flag on a bamboo pole. The men traveled in 3 teams on the return trip. A few went with the ponies. Cherry, Wilson, and Jack took 1 dog team. Captain Scott and Mears went with the other. Ranger and Osmond were the lead dogs for that team. It went well at first. Osmond finally seemed to be accepting Ranger as part of the pack. Both dogs were strong. The 2 teams traveled 78 miles in the first 3 days of the return trip. But then Captain Scott decided to cut a corner on their planned route to save time. The shortcut was full of delays. The snow and ice were riddled with crevices, great gaping cracks that could swallow a man in an instant. The ice felt different under Ranger's paws here, hollow and weak. It made the hair on his neck stand up. The teams had to slow down. They crossed more crevices than Jack could count. "Good job, dog," he called over to Ranger, who was leading the other sled team beside Osmond. But at that moment, the rear dogs on that team fell into a crevice and dropped out of sight. The two dogs in front of them scrambled and clawed at the edge of the gaping crack, but they slipped into the gaping crack, but they slipped into. Then another two dogs and another. Finally, only Osmond and Ranger were left, struggling to keep a foothold. The sled had come to a stop on the other side of the crevice. Whoa, Cherry shouted. He and Jack tethered their team and ran to help. Easy, dogs, easy. Jack called to Osmond and Ranger as they tried to keep their footing. The rest of the team hung in their harnesses in midair. Ranger and Osmond pulled against the weight of the dogs that had fallen, but the load was too heavy. They couldn't gain even an inch. Ranger whimpered. If he and Osmond couldn't hold on, all the dogs would be lost down the crevice. The supplies, too. The pemmican and biscuits, the medicine and tools, and Ranger's first aid kit. How would Jack and the other men survive the rest of their journey? And how would Ranger even ever get home? Ranger crouched low. He pulled against the rope with all his might, but his paws were slipping. He knew he couldn't last much longer.